Hey tech enthusiasts, welcome to another deep dive where we're tackling one of IT's most enduring debates, Windows Server versus Linux Server. I'm not here to tell you which one is better, because that's not how enterprise IT works. I'm here to show you exactly when and why you choose one over the other for specific workloads and environments. By the end of this video, you'll understand the core architectural differences between both platforms, real performance benchmarks with actual numbers, licensing and cost implications that affect your bottom line, security considerations you can't afford to ignore, and practical migration paths if you're considering a switch. Let's cut through the noise and get to what actually matters for your infrastructure decisions. Before we dive into benchmarks and use cases, let's establish a baseline understanding of how these platforms fundamentally differ. Windows Server architecture is built on the NT kernel, with a heavy emphasis on its GUI-based management approach, though PowerShell has dramatically improved its command line capabilities. The framework is deeply integrated with Microsoft's ecosystem, Active Directory, Exchange, SharePoint, creating a unified but somewhat closed environment. Linux, by contrast, follows the Unix philosophy of modular components that do one thing extremely well. Nearly everything in Linux is treated as a file, configurations are typically plain text, and the system is designed to be manipulated through the command line first, with GUIs as optional add-ons. The architectural differences aren't just academic, they directly impact how you'll manage the system, what skill sets your team needs, how updates and security patches are handled, and ultimately, your operational overhead. Let's talk real performance. I've set up identical hardware configurations running Windows Server 2022 and Ubuntu Server 22.04 to test various scenarios. For database performance, Linux outperformed by 8 to 12% in raw throughput, while Windows showed 5% better performance with SQL Server optimization for data warehousing queries. In web server performance, comparing IIS on Windows versus NGINX on Linux, NGINX handled 27% more concurrent connections before performance degradation, while Windows showed more consistent performance under sustained heavy load. For file server operations, Windows outperformed for large file operations by 15%, while Linux showed better performance with many small files being 22% faster. Looking at virtualization overhead between Hyper-V and KVM, KVM showed 7% lower overhead for CPU virtualization, while Hyper-V had slightly better memory management efficiency. The key takeaway? Neither platform wins across all categories. Your workload should determine your choice. Now for everyone's favorite part, the money. This isn't just about purchase price, it's about total cost of ownership. The Windows Server licensing model includes a base license of $972 for Standard Edition or $6,155 for Data Center, plus CAL requirements at $38 to $40 per user or device, and additional costs for SQL Server, Exchange, and other services. Linux server costs range from $0 for community editions up to $17,500 for enterprise support contracts with no CAL requirements and many enterprise applications available as open source. There are hidden costs to consider as well. For staffing expertise, Windows admins' average salary is around $85,000, Linux admins around $96,000, and cross-trained professionals $105,000 or more. Training requirements differ too, with Windows certification paths averaging $2,500 and Linux certification options averaging $1,800. Support costs include Microsoft Premier support starting at $25,000 per year, while Enterprise Linux support starts at $15,000 per year. In terms of hardware utilization, Windows Server typically uses 12 to 15% of resources for overhead, while Linux typically uses 3 to 8%, potentially saving up to 10% on hardware costs over 3 years. The most cost-effective choice depends on your existing infrastructure, in-house expertise, and specific workloads. Security isn't just about which system has more vulnerabilities, it's about your risk profile and defensive capabilities. The Windows Server security model features centralized updates through Windows Update, role-based access control via Active Directory, security baselines and group policy, and Windows Defender integration. The Linux security model includes package-based updates through repositories, granular permission system, and SE Linux or AppArmor, minimal installation footprint, and open-source security auditing. Looking at real-world security metrics, for patch response time, Windows averages critical patch delivery in 8.2 days, while major Linux distros average critical patch delivery in 4.7 days. Comparing attack surface, a default Windows Server 2022 installation has about 95 listening services, while a default Ubuntu Server 22.04 minimal installation has only 12 listening services. For compliance considerations, Windows offers native support for FIPS and common criteria, while Linux has similar certifications available, but implementation varies by distribution. Regarding ransomware resilience, Windows has a higher target profile but built-in rollback features, while Linux has a lower target profile and simpler recovery through system design. The security advantage depends heavily on your implementation and maintenance practices rather than the platform itself. Let's get practical. Which server makes sense for specific scenarios? Windows Server excels at Active Directory environments for user management of predominantly Windows clients, group policy deployment, and Microsoft ecosystem integration. It's also ideal for Microsoft-specific workloads like Exchange Server, SharePoint, and Microsoft SQL Server with specific optimizations. Windows Desktop Virtualization is another strength with seamless remote desktop services, AppV application virtualization, and Windows 365 integration. Linux Server excels at web infrastructure, including NGINX Apache performance, PHP, Python, Node.js development environments, and container orchestration with Kubernetes. It's also great for high-performance computing, including scientific computing clusters, render farms, and AIML training environments. For IoT and edge computing, Linux offers low resource requirements, custom kernel options, and deployment flexibility. Hybrid scenarios are increasingly common, including Active Directory authentication for Linux services, Windows with WSL for development, and cross-platform monitoring solutions. Thinking about switching platforms? Here's what you need to consider. For Windows to Linux migration, the preparation phase includes skills assessment and training, application compatibility analysis, and directory service replacement strategy. The pilot implementation should include Samba as Active Directory replacement, authentication integration, and file sharing compatibility testing. Common challenges include application dependencies, PowerShell scripting alternatives, and group policy equivalent configurations. For Linux to Windows migration, the preparation phase involves licensing cost analysis, GUI versus CLI management adjustment, and automation strategy adaptation. The pilot implementation should use Windows Subsystem for Linux as a transition tool, service equivalency mapping, and performance expectation adjustment. Common challenges include script conversion, security model differences, and resource requirement increases. Migration tools worth considering include Microsoft's Linux migration assessment tools, configuration management platforms like Ansible or Chef, and containerization as a transition strategy. Let's wrap this up with some final thoughts. There is no universal better choice. Your requirements determine the right platform. Skills availability should heavily influence your decision. Hybrid approaches are increasingly common and practical. Container technologies are blurring the platform distinctions. The most successful IT departments I've worked with aren't dogmatic about their server choices. They're pragmatic. They choose Windows, where it integrates best with their Microsoft-centric needs, Linux, where performance, cost, or specific workloads demand it, and they implement cross-platform management tools to maintain sanity. If you found this comparison helpful, hit that subscribe button and notification bell. Drop your specific server environment questions in the comments, and I'll use them to guide future deep dives. Want Windows Server or RDS keys without draining your budget? Head to ProsoftKeys.com, verified, fast, and built for IT people who know what they're doing. Thanks for watching, and remember, the best technology choice is the one that solves your specific problems.